Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar focusing on Major Lindsey Africa's 2024 In-House Council Compensation Survey. And today we are going to focus on the findings from the Northern California market. And joining me today to go over this information and to add their insights, I'm thrilled to be joined by my colleagues Pham and Anna Gorodetsky. My name is Lauren Horan, and I'll be your technical moderator behind the scenes. I'll be in the background answering any technical questions that you have. If you experience any difficulties, just put your question in the Q&A and I will help you out. Before I hand it over to my colleagues, I just have a few quick items to run through. Today, all attendees are in listen-only mode with cameras off for the duration of the call. And as a reminder, this call is being recorded and it will be sent out in an email to everyone who registered for today's webinar. We expect the event to run about 1 hour, including time for Q&A at the end, and you can pose questions to the speakers anytime throughout the event. Just use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. At the end of today's webinar, a quick survey will appear on the screen. We'd love for you to take a minute and fill it out. Let us know how we did today, as well as any other topics you're interested in seeing us cover in the future. And now I will hand it over to my colleagues, Anna and Pham, to get us started.
Great. Thank you, Lauren, and welcome. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Anna Gorodetsky, and I'm a managing director in the San Francisco office of MLA in our in-house council recruiting division. Originally from Ukraine, I came to the US 35 years ago and received my bachelor's in law degrees from UC Berkeley. I then practiced employment law at Morrison and Foerster and joined MLA 10 years ago, just celebrated my anniversary last month. I sit in San Francisco and work in our in-house council recruiting division. So I place lawyers at companies of all sizes and in a broad spectrum of industries across the US. I often have compensation conversations with candidates and clients, and I'm excited to share these survey results with you. And turning it over to Pham.
Hi, everyone. My name is Pham, and I'm also a managing director with the in-house council recruiting group in MLA's San Francisco office. I have been with MLA for the past 6 years. I was born in Vietnam and escaped with my family by boat as a young child, landing in Oakland, California. I went to college at Stanford University and law school at Columbia and started my legal career as a project finance associate at Milbank Tweed in New York. Then went in-house for a number of years before discovering my love of recruiting. Anna and I are thrilled to be with you today to discuss these important trends in in-house compensation.
Great, thank you, Pham. So before we get into numbers, let's go over the sample size here and the types of functions that we're going to be covering. So for this survey, we collaborated with Western Management Group and we invited over 35,000 in-house counsel to participate. Not all of them did, but we did get over 2,100 responses. This is a global survey with respondents residing in over 46 countries. And the functions that we covered are Chief Legal Officer, General Counsel, Regional and County General Counsel, Deputy General Counsel, Assistant and Associate General Counsel, Senior Counsel, Counsel, and Chief Compliance Officer. This is the first time in the history of us doing this that we are delineating between Chief Legal Officer and General Counsel in the survey. And the reason for that is that, while these two terms are often used interchangeably, there is a trend that we're seeing towards the Chief Legal Officer title, especially for senior general counsels. The CLO title directly reflects the attorney's position in the C-suite and on the executive leadership team, and usually commands higher compensation than that for general counsel, and you will see that borne out in this survey. In terms of demographics, you will see that we have a wide spread of revenue bands to give us a broad look at companies of various sizes. Half of the respondents are in companies with over $1 billion in revenue, and about 13% are at the largest companies in the world with over $20 billion in revenue. It's a fairly even mix of public and private company respondents. On the diversity front, respondents from the United States were a little bit less diverse than they were in our previous survey in 2022. This year, 73% of respondents were white, up from 66% in our last survey. It's our hope that future surveys will reflect the growing diversity in this profession, and we look forward to seeing a continued drive towards compensation parity between lawyers of different ethnicities. With regard to gender, 58% of the US respondents were men. Women accounted for about 40% of the total here, and 2% preferred not to say or identified as an alternative gender. Let's get into the acronym that we will use most often today, and that's TAC or TAC, Total Actual Compensation. And it stands and encompasses salary for 2023 as well as the actual bonus paid in 2023. Notably, equity is not included in this number. So when we're going to be talking about TAC or TAC, we're talking about base and bonus only, no equity. Before getting into the survey results for Northern California, let's look at the national numbers. This chart looks at all of the legal functions that we polled, and predictably you will see that the more senior the title, the higher the compensation. As I've mentioned before, this is the first survey in which we delineated CLOs from GCs, and as you can see, there is a material difference in compensation for GCs and CLOs. Here we see that CLOs are above the 650K mark on average nationally in base and bonus in TAC, whereas general counsel are at 521K. So it's over 100K difference in TAC between CLOs and GCs. Again, this is not yet Northern California, this is national. Now let's compare these 2023 survey results with those from 2021. So 2 years ago, we did the survey and we have this comparison here. What is the key takeaway? The key takeaway here is that on the national level, TAC has remained relatively unchanged since our previous survey for most legal functions. We have seen that regional general counsel, deputy general counsel, and associate general counsel has risen a bit, and that counsel compensation actually increased by 17%. And that's likely due to the fact that counsel level compensation is more base heavy versus bonus heavy. And it's important to note that counsel continues to be the role with the fewest respondents each year. And so it's hard to really say for certain whether there is a clear trend in terms of an increase in compensation for counsel. Why has compensation at a national level been relatively stagnant for the last couple of years? Well, uncertain economic times, inflation, geopolitical instability, election year, these are all contributing factors to that. The fact that AGC, DGC compensation is going up is not surprising to us. GCs and CLOs more than ever are thinking about succession planning and properly incentivizing and empowering their teams. And so the AGC and DGC roles are seen as natural successors to the GC or CLO. And companies are starting to put their actions where their mouths are, and they're compensating these functions competitively in order to encourage strong GC hopefuls to stay on. Notably, while not represented on this slide, another big surprise for us is the material increase in compensation for chief compliance officers since our last survey 2 years ago. Our CCO respondents reported that their average cash compensation increased by 81% since 2 years ago. And so, we didn't expect such a big increase, but we're not surprised that there is an increase. Given that all industries are becoming more and more regulated, coupled with the fact that compliance and legal are becoming bifurcated, the need for compliance professionals has grown rapidly, and this is why we're seeing such a huge increase there. On the national level, the 1% drop in compensation for CLOs and GCs relative to 2 years ago was driven almost entirely by bonuses, and that's what you're seeing here, which makes sense given the economic trends of the past couple of years. So while base pay actually increased 4% over the last 2 years for CLOs and GCs in the US as a group, 2023 actual bonus pay dropped 10% since 2 years ago. So this is not surprising because variable compensation such as bonuses and equity, these are the first to be impacted by economic forces and the resulting company performance. So even during challenging economic times, companies try to do what they can to keep base salary at bay, right? They know that they need to do that in order to attract and retain top senior talent. So it's that bonus compensation that starts dropping during more challenging times. So now Tam will start to delve a little bit more into Northern California, which differs from the national data in some significant ways.
Thanks, Anna. As we get more granular for the Northern California market, we see an interesting trend with TAC increasing significantly for most roles. 16% for DGCs, 11% for 8 assistant general counsels, 14% for senior counsels, and 13% for counsels. CLOs, GCs, and associate general counsels stayed about the same. Unlike what we saw in the national trend with pay staying stagnant for most roles, NorCal saw a 10+% increase for DGCs, assistant general counsels, senior counsels, and counsels. This is consistent with our searches in the Bay Area, where we have seen increased compensation over the past 2 years. When we break down the combined CLO and GC compensation in NorCal, we see an interesting trend that's different from the national numbers. There was almost no change in base pay, but a significant jump in bonus pay, about 30% from 2021 to 2023. This is quite a departure from our national numbers that showed CLO and GC bonus pay decreasing by about 10% during the same period. We can surmise that the bonus numbers reported in 2023 were for 2022 performance, and much of 2022 was in a high growth phase in the Bay Area, frenzied almost in the tech and biotech sectors here. We know that many candidates were getting significant retention bonuses in 2022, in addition to their regular bonuses. The tech slowdown came in the final quarter of 2022, and then all of 2023 was slow. We would expect bonus numbers for 2023 in NorCal to probably decrease. When broken down into their individual roles, CLOs are out-earning GCs by a significant degree. 2023 TAC was 22% higher for CLOs than GCs nationally. In NorCal, the difference is not quite as drastic, but still significant, with CLOs reporting 15% higher base and 7% higher bonus over GCs on average. It's a good thing that our report this year separates the numbers significantly for the higher profile CLO role, where they are part of the executive team, often at publicly traded companies, and their compensation is often publicly listed alongside other executive team members. Since the categories were not separated in the last report, we don't have a comparison to 2021 numbers, unfortunately. Unlike CLOs and GCs, DGCs and AGCs taken as a group saw both their base pay and bonuses increase slightly on a national scale. A slight rise in total comp deriving from a 6% base pay increase and a 4% increase in bonuses between 2021 and 2023. NorCal DGCs and AGCs also saw a 4% increase in TAC. Let's now contrast the DGC compensation with AGCs, which shows that DGCs may be doing somewhat better than the combined total first indicates, both nationally and in NorCal. 2023 TAC was 30% higher for DGCs than AGCs nationally, and 13% over the combined 2023 TAC. Bonuses, again, play a considerable role in differentiating comp between the two. The trend is essentially mirrored and even extended in NorCal. where the DGCs are seeing a 42% difference in cash compensation over AGCs, driven by 100% higher bonuses on average. This is crazy numbers. But it is not too surprising given the elevated status of the DGC in our searches in the last couple of years, as Anna previously touched on, with more clients focusing on succession planning in more of our searches. This may be a general trend in legal departments overall. Back to you, Anna.
Thank you, Tam. In this slide, you will see that, predictably, the more senior the role, the higher the bonus is as a percent of TAC, right? Bonuses, as you know, could be company performance-based, they could be individual performance-based, or a combination of the two. And when individual performance is taken into account, they give the employee a quantifiable personal stake in how they're compensated. So the fact that we see higher bonuses for more senior roles makes sense, because bonuses are a great way to incentivize top employees to do excellent work. And this data point kind of further reinforces the notion that the Office of the General Counsel is seen as a strategic partner to the business, and more so. Bonuses now represent over 40% of a general counsel's or chief legal officer's annual compensation in the US. And this figure is in line with that for other members of the C-suite whose variable compensation is tied to company performance. While the CLO and the general counsel positions received the highest proportion of its cash compensation and bonuses, other senior roles saw large bonus percentages as well. We're talking about regional general counsels or deputy general counsels or AGCs. They are all seeing bonuses making up 30 to 40% of their total cash comp on average, with only the most junior lawyers receiving average bonuses of under 25%. Again, CCOs here are, as you can see on the last graphic there, on average, bonuses are making up a whopping 60% of their cash compensation, again, indicating and reinforcing the growing need for companies to attract and retain top talent in this role. And again, looking at national numbers here, we can see that in the United States, average TAC compensation for CLOs and GC ranges from high 300K range for companies with less than 100 million in annual revenue to way over $1 million for companies with more than 10 billion in annualized revenue. Below the 5 billion mark, average TAC actually decreased for GCs and CLOs. However, between the 5 and 10 billion in revenue range, that shows a stronger increase than the overall average, with a boost of 7% relative to our survey 2 years ago. So depending on the size of company, CLOs are making either similarly to where they were 2 years ago, a little bit less or a little bit more. And here we can look at the comparison of CLO or GC TAC by public versus private company on both the national level as well as for Northern California. And what we see in this graphic is that Northern California roughly mirrors the national trend, in which the general counsel and CLOs at public companies are out-earning their contemporaries at private companies by a significant margin, right? So nationally, public companies, CLOs, and GCs are earning 40% more overall than at private companies. And this is on average. And this is driven by bonuses that are an average of 63% higher in public companies versus private companies. And in Northern California, these percentages actually increase. So for public bonuses, we're seeing 74% higher, leading to a 59% higher TAC. This is an interesting slide. So now this is national statistics. And it looks at CLO and GC compensation by industry. And I think none of us are surprised to see that CLOs and general counsels working for the government, that's the shortest line there, are paid less than their private and public company contemporaries, regardless of industry. But I think what's more difficult to understand is why CLOs and GCs and, say, the advertising, publishing, and media space rank the highest here, right? They had the highest average TAC compensation of over $737,000, followed by the real estate industry at $736,000, energy and public utility at close to $700,000, and then telecommunications. And this slide does the same for Northern California. And it's a bit of a surprise, especially as compared to the national numbers. This seems to indicate that in California, the medical device industry, which you see up there on top, is by far the best compensated one for CLOs and general counsels. I would take these numbers with a grain of salt because we did have fewer respondents for each industry here in California, and specifically in Northern California as compared to national. So these numbers might be susceptible to skewing. In our experience with placements in Northern California, compensation for CLOs and GCs, say in pharma, in biotech, in med tech, it's as strong, if not stronger, than in the medical device space. And we don't necessarily see that represented on this slide, where biotech and pharmaceutical is definitely materially less than med device. You might be surprised to see that the technology industry is not up there in terms of compensation, but that may be explained by the fact that many of the technology companies in the Bay Area are smaller companies, including pre-revenue, early to late stage startups, and newly public companies with low revenues. And technology companies use equity as one of the major compensation levers, and that is not reflected in the survey. And this is probably why we're not seeing tech comp higher than where we're seeing it. Education is notable on this list in that no bonus pay was reported by respondents, so their TAC is entirely base pay. Turning it over to Tam.
Thanks. Whereas the U.S. national average combined CLO and GC TAC compensation was $571,000, local averages diverged widely among major metropolitan areas. The lowest average TAC compensation was in the Salt Lake City metro area of $397,000, whereas Miami reported the highest compensation levels at $740,000. That's quite a big difference. The compensation levels in each market appear to track the common industries in those markets. As noted, highly regulated sectors like energy, a key industry in Houston, for example, command higher TAC compensation. On the other hand, tech-heavy locales like Seattle and Silicon Valley might see lower TAC compensation because of the prevalence of smaller-sized companies in tech, as well as the equity compensation models many tech companies use. Perhaps unsurprisingly, GCs working in larger metro areas with higher costs of living, such as New York and Los Angeles, earn higher TAC compensation than those working in smaller metro areas, such as Seattle and Denver. Interestingly, while a Silicon Valley respondent reported the highest TAC for 2023, the next three highest TACs reported were from New York, LA, and Miami. In this slide, you'll see that while CCOs in Northern California saw a 61% increase in TAC over the 2021 national average, it is still 12% less than the 2023 national average TAC for CCOs, probably because of the emphasis on equity compensation for the heavily tech and biotech focus in NorCal. We also see in NorCal an increased focus on the compliance function in recent years, as Anna mentioned previously. This graph shows the breakdown by role and ethnicity on a national level. The percentages show how much they differ from the national average TAC for the role. As you can see, these numbers vary widely depending on the role. At the CLO level, all minorities were above the national average. In fact, Black CLOs were compensated 18% higher than the national average. We attribute this higher compensation for minority CLOs to a desire in recent years by large public companies with published executive compensation to diversify their executive ranks and also try to retain their superstar minority CLOs. However, as you move down the ranks, minorities tended to be paid less, and in some cases, significantly less. For example, CCOs who are Black and Hispanic were compensated around 50% less than the national average, and Hispanic counsels were compensated 30% less than the national average. There's definitely a caveat to these numbers, given that the respondent pool was smaller for minorities and also smaller for CCOs and counsel as compared to CLOs and GC respondents. Given the stark difference with the typically published CLO compensation at public companies, there seems to be a lot more work to get to full and transparent pay equity for all minorities. We hope that the numbers will be better for the next comp survey. When we look at the breakdown of TAC by role and gender, this difference also varies significantly by the role. But generally, female in-house lawyers are paid less in the US than their male counterparts. Surprisingly, the female CLO is paid 4% higher than the male CLO, but the female GC is paid 26% less than their male counterpart. As with the ethnicity numbers discussed previously, publicly disclosed CLO and executive team compensation may help keep those numbers on parity. It is important to note that the wage disclosure laws in recent years that have been enacted have definitely narrowed the gender pay gap in states that have enacted those laws. It goes to show that transparency in compensation at companies goes a long way towards pay equity. For the gender breakdown in NorCal, there is an outlier data point with female GCs being paid significantly less than male GCs. We can probably attribute this to a limited number of respondents or that it was affected by too many outlier numbers. However, for every other role, including the CLO, female in-house attorneys in NorCal are paid higher or the same as their male counterparts. California was one of the first states to enact the wage disclosure laws, and we probably see the effects of those laws played out here on this chart. In the searches that Anna and I conduct in NorCal, we generally see a lot of parity in comps between men and women. In conclusion, we note that generally, with the one exception of the council level in 2021, every role has increased in TAC from 2019 to 2023. We generally expect that trend to continue. In our recent searches in NorCal, we have seen a slower hiring market than 2 years ago, but we have not seen a decrease in compensation and expect that trend to continue upwards. Anna and I hope you have all found this presentation to be helpful. We've left a lot of time for questions because we know that you probably have some questions that you'd like to ask us, and we're happy to sort of specifically address any of those. And I will let this go back to Lauren.
Thank you, Tam and Anna, for your insights and your valuable expertise behind the data. And speaking of the data, we do have another slide with the QR code, and we do have, we will be sending a copy of the report with the email that we'll be sending out with the recording of the webinar. So you can all dive deeper into this data. And now we encourage you to ask some questions, and I see a few coming in now. So Tam, would you like to take the first one? Someone asked, how does equity factor into this analysis?
As you can see with the NorCal numbers, and we actually tried to ask for equity. I think we started that in the comp survey for 2 years ago. The issue with equity with respect to getting a very clear indicator of how how consistent is across the board. The problem we face is that their equity is very varied between different industries, as well as size of companies, whether they're private or public. Obviously, public company equity in stock is very different than private equity company equity in options. So one is liquid, one is not, and is only got when you are there's an acquisition event. So but in general, as we try to sort of nail down the equity compensation in our surveys, we can try to, in the future, break down by those different areas. Right now, I don't think it's as clear, and that's why we didn't include those in our presentation. But you will notice, and what Anna and I have mentioned, is that in NorCal, a lot of our industries are very tech and biotech and fintech heavy, such that equity is a significant component of people's compensation, overall compensation, whether it's private or public companies. And so you can see that the Bay Area comps are actually not as high as you would expect because you hear so much about large tech companies being the highest paying companies in the country. However, because of the number of smaller tech companies in the Bay Area, that actually skews those numbers down as well. So a lot of it really depends on where you're located, what size companies you're at, and what industry you're in terms of whether equity is a significant component or not.
Thank you, Tam. Yes, I think bottom line is that equity remains a huge lever that employers use in their compensation, and we are not seeing a decrease in the equity numbers. And in fact, we're seeing even more junior roles, senior counsel, starting with senior counsels, have some equity stake in private and public companies. We have another question. Would like to hear a little bit more about the current hiring market, how long a retained search is taking at the CLO GC level and more junior. Are you seeing clients reduce their legal team size? Which areas of in-house practice are in the highest demand right now? Look, in terms of the current hiring market, obviously there is a dynamic of there being more qualified, viable candidates out there looking and fewer companies looking, because companies are trying to do more with less in many cases and have budgetary and headcount constraints. However, slowly but surely, we're seeing that change. And even over the last couple of weeks to last couple of months, we've seen an uptick in retained searches. Biotech is back with a number of GC searches that MLA is handling. And so I think companies are realizing, look, geopolitical climate, be it what it is, economic forces being what they are, we still need to be able to project for the future and hire for the future. And so retained searches are taking, depending on the role, anywhere from sometimes we've completed searches in as little as 3 weeks up to 3 to 4 months. A lot depends on how quickly our clients are taking the candidates through the process, and not so much on delays on our end. In terms of reduced legal team sizes, we're not seeing that as much now. We definitely saw that more, I would say, starting in late 2022 is when we suddenly realized that we're moving away from an employee-driven to a much more employer-driven market. And we saw a number of layoffs that through end of 2022, through much of 2023, we're seeing fewer layoffs this year and less reductions in force this year. And so we're actually seeing legal team sizes starting to grow. Which areas of in-house practice are in highest demand right now? Here in the Bay Area, of course, we're doing tech and biotech and fintech, but we're seeing searches across every imaginable industry, from renewable energy to space companies to retail, and many more. Pam, would you like to take the next question?
Yes, I think there's one here that asked about if we see final higher salaries differing by gender, race, and ethnicity, all other things being equal. I think, as Anna and I sort of alluded to in the presentation, we actually don't see that too much in NorCal. I think there's still some, if you break down the national numbers, I think there's still definitely minorities and women being paid a little bit less than others on the national and other locations. But however, for NorCal, we're definitely not seeing that. I think our clients are asking for diversity. They're asking for gender diversity. They're asking for ethnicity diversity. They're asking for, every possible kind of diversity that we could muster. And I think, MLA is very, very much known for bringing diverse slates to our clients. And so we're definitely focused on that piece, and our clients are as well. And with the actual, compensation offers, we're definitely not seeing a huge difference between, those factors.
Yes, agreed. And there's a question here. Any trend in GC roles being separate and reporting into CLOs at companies? Differences in public versus private companies on this new hierarchy? I wouldn't say that there's a trend in GCs being separate. I think only very large companies can afford having a CLO and a GC. And in those cases, CLO happens to be more, board facing and business facing, whereas the GC is really the de facto, legal head overseeing legal and really being entrenched in all things legal. But I think what we're seeing is the GCs are more and more asking for the CLO title instead of the GC title, right? So it still reports into the CEO, hopefully. There are some cases where the GCs report into, a CFO or another role, but typically, and of course, highly preferentially reporting to the CEO. But the reason we're seeing this demand, almost, I would say, on the part of many GCs to be called chief legal officers is because, again, it squarely puts them as part of the C-suite, as part of the executive leadership team. And lawyers want business titles. They feel like they're part of the business. They're providing business, commercially savvy, legal advice. And so they want a business title. And so, no, we're not seeing a trend of GCs reporting into CLOs.
Correct. There is a question here that's asking about what is your recommendation where a pre-IPO company is asking, what are you looking for? My answer has been that I expect to be paid in line with my peers at the company, understanding that certain roles such as CFO traditionally earn the GC. And that is correct. But also it really depends, in this case, it is a private pre-IPO company. Obviously on the public side, it's a little easier because, those salaries are publicly disclosed. I would say with the wage disclosure rules that are in effect for a lot of states, the one other thing that you have in terms of a lever is to ask them what their range is. And at this point, most companies, especially if they have a global presence, if they're in multiple states, actually will set out, publish pay ranges, so that you know that you're sort of within a particular range, and that you're not, sort of negotiating against yourself. So I think that's something that you should definitely ask, even if it's in a state that doesn't have a wage disclosure law, because a lot of those companies will actually, adopt the public ranges for their headcount, in terms of their roles that are publicly published.
Yeah. I mean, the best comparison for, compensation is not necessarily where you are relative to other executives in your organization, but where do GCs end up for similarly situated companies. So if there's any way for you to get data on a peer company and and what that compensation is for that general counsel, that's a much better comparison, because depending on when the executive arrived at the company, there's just so many factors there that can be used to differentiate you from the CFO or the CTO or the CMO. And so I find that the much better comparison is, what do GCs of similarly situated companies in terms of market cap, in terms of revenue, in terms of employee size, what are they making? There's a question here. What do you think about a position called GC, which reports into a VP, not a CFO or a CEO? Is it really a GC? No, because
No, it's not.
because a GC is at the very least a VP, and preferably an SVP. And so if the GC is reporting into a VP, then there's definitely a problem. I mean, look, all of the variations on the theme of reporting into the CFO or the COO, they're problematic because they indicate, if nothing else, that there is at least a hesitation as to the value of legal, if not an outright denigration of the value of legal, right? And not in every case is it the reporting into the CFO or someone other than CEO is hugely problematic, but it definitely deserves some real diligence as to why.
And if, as you can see from our presentation, the huge difference in pay between the CLO and the GC often reflects this reporting structure. CLOs are reporting into the CEO by nature of their title, as they're part of the executive team, whereas some GCs may not. And so you can see that there is a big difference in terms of how they're viewed within the company, whether they have a direct line to the CEO, and a lot of GCs, may not have that direct line. They may be reporting into the CFO or the COO. So it's clear there's a huge difference depending on what that level of reporting is. And so that's something that should be really important. In a case where, the GC is reporting to the VP position, the title doesn't really make sense, because it's probably more of a head of legal role, which if it's not a VP, that's pretty, that's pretty low. So I would say it's really not a GC.
Yes. Someone is asking about Salt Lake City legal compensation and whether it aligns more with the Midwest comp trends or West Coast comp trends. I don't know, but if you remember that slide, you will see that it's definitely one of the lower paid markets, comparatively speaking. And so it probably is the case that comp aligns more with Midwest than with the West Coast, because the West Coast is one of the higher compensated markets. So that's my intuition there. And then there's a question on, do you have any salary data on where the GC also serves as the CCO? That is a very good question. One that actually I was asking our marketing team just over the past few days as we were getting ready for this presentation. They did not delineate CCO from hybrid CCO GC in this survey from what it is that I understand, but we will absolutely take that into consideration in our future surveys, because it is an important distinction where the CCO is, a CCO only versus the CCO is also at the same time a CLO or a GC. So, good question.
And I think anecdotally in our searches, I would say, Anna, that the GCs with an additional business function or operational function do actually get paid more, because if it's a C function, then they are, also on the C-suite, and that's an additional responsibility set of team members that are reporting to them. So their team sizes are larger. And so the additional responsibility often comes with additional comp as well. I mean, whether it's certainly not double, but there is a bump in comp when the GC takes on those other executive functions.
Especially in regulated industries. But again, there's more and more a trend to bifurcate the roles, which there's a question right now. Do you see a trend of CCOs reporting into CLOs? In fact, if anything, we now see a trend away from that, right? We're seeing a trend to bifurcate legal and compliance, especially in highly regulated industries like financial services or life sciences, where the CCOs and the CLOs both report into the executive, the chief executive.
Great. Well, we have just a couple more questions, but I just wanted to kind of ask you, what should a company take away from this data in terms of thinking about the compensation of its GC and CLO and the legal department, versus how should individual lawyers think about the findings as they assess their own compensation standing?
I think the companies should take this data and rest assured that even during challenging times, when the future is not necessarily predictable, they should continue compensating their lawyers commensurate with the value that they're adding. We're not expecting that compensation for lawyers will decline regardless of economic forces, and we've seen that play out over the last 2 years. While they haven't risen as much as they've risen for our previous survey, they've been stagnant and in some cases have risen a little bit, right? And so I think companies need to continue valuing legal and paying legal commensurate with that value that they're adding. And I think lawyers should continue utilizing resources like this and others in order, as ammunition, in order to be able to negotiate offers that are, comparatively speaking to their, contemporaries, are fair and equitable.
Yeah, and I think just use it as one of the resources, right? There's a lot out there that's publicly available. There's also paid services, but for the most part, this should be a good way for you to benchmark your comp in your industry, in your location against others. Keeping in mind, obviously, our data is not 100% perfect and accurate, but it gives you a good indication of generally what the market can bear. So it's ammunition in your negotiations with your managers. But I totally agree with Anna with respect to companies seeing that there are, it has not been a significant decrease and in fact some increase in comp in NorCal. So they should not take this as an opportunity to, this time sort of slow down in the tech sector to decrease pay or not increase because they'll risk losing good people when the market turns. And we can see that, you know, the market within tech and biotech can turn very quickly. And, you know, you don't want to be left in a situation where all your good team members are leaving because they can get better packages elsewhere.
Thank you. We had a question regarding remote work. Are you seeing less remote work in NorCal, and how will that affect NorCal compensation?
We are seeing less remote sort of requirements or remote roles in NorCal. How that has affected compensation in the last 2 years is that, or you know, a previous survey is that in the pandemic, Northern California companies, California-based companies were hiring more remote workers based in other locations and paying them maybe a little bit less, but not too, you know, not sort of, you know, consistent with the cost of living decrease in those other areas. So we were seeing the pay in the other locations, let's say Salt Lake City, going up because those folks were being hired by Bay Area companies. As people come back to more on-site or hybrid work situations, particularly in the Bay Area, we're probably just going to see, you know, those salaries continue to increase as the cost of living in the Bay Area is significant. That has not increased. And so we don't see that compensation going down as people are called back, but that actually might affect compensation in those other locations where people were moving from the Bay Area out. So there's probably going to be fewer roles that are fully remote. And so, you know, in those areas, I would say compensation actually might go down.
Interesting. And then one final question. Any major surprises or insights, findings that caught your attention from our 2024 survey?
You know, for me, no major surprises here in the Bay Area. You know, the fact that the compensation overall was more or less stagnant was borne out by the searches that we have done. We have not seen a major decline in compensation in private or public companies. Maybe we've seen maybe a little bit less willingness on the part of companies to provide equity to some of the more junior employees, for example, right? That we have seen. And maybe in general, we've seen a little bit of a decline in equity over the last 2 years for, say, general counsels. But overall, base and bonus numbers have remained relatively similar. So that's not a surprise. Again, the CCO numbers, just how high they are as far as both base and bonus is surprising. But again, it could be the fact that some of those CCO roles are also CCO/GC or CLO. And again, next year, we're going to try to, in the next 2 years, we're going to try to bifurcate the two again. That was a little bit surprising, just how stark that difference was. Tam, what about you?
Yeah, I agree with you on the CCO numbers. The other surprise, and I was happy to see, was the delineation between the CLO role and the GC role, because, you know, for many years in the past, we have combined those two and used them interchangeably in terms of our data collection for the comp surveys. Now that it's been delineated, we see a stark difference in the pay in those two roles. And as we discussed extensively in our presentation, you know, it has to do with the fact that the CLO is an executive team member, and that makes a significant difference with respect to their pay, both in base and in bonus. And if we have equity numbers, I think it would also be reflected in the equity as well.
Yeah. One last question here. Are most roles on-site or hybrid? By far, most roles are hybrid. And I would say the new normal is 2 to 3 days a week. In some rare cases, 4 days a week. We rarely work on roles that are 5 days a week or fully remote.
Though did you guys all just see the Amazon announcement where all 5 days have to be on site at specific locations, depending on who the employees are supporting? I just talked to someone who, a client of mine who was at One Medical and recently acquired by Amazon. And it has thrown the company legal department in just it's a mess over there. And I think everyone is really concerned. They're giving them some time, but pretty much everyone is actually, or the people who have been remote or hired during COVID will actually now have to move. So there are no exceptions for folks that were hired previously. So this is kind of interesting. We're seeing, a move towards on-site, but as Anna said, mostly in a hybrid situation. The 5 days on site is actually quite unusual, but we are also seeing that trend. And, the Amazon announcement recently is really interesting. And I think we'll all be very interested to see what other companies might do going forward that are high profile. I think I would say that it could be a little bit short-sighted because as they might actually lose a number of really good employees in this process, forcing those employees to come back on site 5 days a week. So when the hiring market turns and it becomes an employee market, I do think that that's going to be problematic for those companies that are having very strict on-site rules.
Thank you. Certainly is interesting times. And I just wanted to close up by giving our contact information. Thank you, everyone who was here participating. Your questions were really great and thoughtful, and wanted to encourage everyone to reach out if you have any further questions on the data, the report, what we talked about today. Anna and Tam would be happy to connect with you. And so we've reached just about an hour. I wanted to again thank you for joining us, and thanks Anna and Tam for your insights. And I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your day. And thank you again.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks.